I will pass this off to Stuart and Isa. They're our hosting masters. They're going to be talking about best practices and benefits of LabKey hosting.
Thank you for that introduction, Marty.
All right. Thank you, Benel, and all the other presenters today. Hopefully everyone's been enjoying the great content of the 2020 LabKey User Conference. My name is Stuart McDonald, and it is my pleasure to share with you some best practices today about hosting LabKey. My colleague Isa Farnick and I are here to share some great things about that. So let's get started. So during our session today, we'll have a brief overview of what is cloud hosting and how that relates to our LabKey hosting offering. We'll cover our take on best practices for running LabKey in the cloud and finish off with a brief overview of our cloud service offerings. So what is cloud hosting? Well, cloud hosting is this generally means that you're running virtualized servers and virtualized networking services in someone else's data center. So this is something typically referred to as blank as a service. Some important attributes of cloud hosting are that your system is isolated. So your network and your computing resources are isolated from other organizations, even though you might share the underlying hardware that runs those resources. Cloud hosting has your data. You manage your data, but it's just as I was saying previously, it's on someone else's physical computer. One important attribute of cloud hosting is it's a pay-as-you-go model versus the traditional model of hosting something yourself in your own data center, where you have to kind of, before you're able to do that, you have to specify and figure out what you think you're going to need from a computing and network resources standpoint, go out and purchase that, and then deploy it, and then hopefully you guessed right. With cloud, you don't have that challenge. You can deploy your application into the cloud, and you can either scale up or scale down that infrastructure based on your needs. And you only pay for what you use rather than what you think you might use. Another important attribute of cloud hosting is that there's generally a programmatic interface, an API, that allows you to change or modify that infrastructure programmatically. So I recognize that our attendees today are probably not all IT experts and probably don't know about all the other aspects of different types of cloud services that are out there and different flavors of cloud hosting. So I'm going to hit briefly on a couple of those types. We'll talk about software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service. So what's software as a service? Well, this is generally a subscription service where you pay a monthly fee to access the application. Some examples are Zoom, which is like we're using today, WebEx, Dropbox, and even Facebook. Some important attributes of software as a service are it's generally multi-tenant. There's generally a single instance of an application, but there are multiple customers that use that. Often, software as a service generally has low administration overhead and a minimal set of customizations. To begin using that software as a service, you frequently just deploy or add users to that application, and then you configure the features and options that are available in the service. I often use analogies to help people understand these things. I kind of like them in the sense because it helps me understand things too. So we'll use a theme today about dwellings. And software as a service, you can think of it as a kind of like a weird apartment building where every unit is the same and they all have the same floor plan. It's very, very cookie cutter. So what is infrastructure as a service? Well, this too is typically server and network infrastructure services running in someone else's data center. Some examples of this are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. These services are very much a do-it-yourself type of system. So in keeping with the theme of dwellings and analogies that I talked about previously, this one's a little bit different, and that you can think of this infrastructure as a service as more like, instead of a dwelling, you go to the big home improvement store and you have a wide array of vast things you can choose from. You have lots of tools and supplies and other things for your home, but you can't really buy a home there, or you can't really buy a dwelling or anything like that. It's kind of really, at the home improvement center, it's really up to you to take those supplies and turn it into something useful. That's essentially what infrastructure as a service is. Some key attributes of infrastructure as a service: it's very has a high level of customization. You have a wide selection of various services and resources that you can use. But that also means you also have a high level of administration overhead or skills required in order to use those resources and turn them into something useful. Our last as a service type that you might hear about is something called platform as a service. In general, platform as a service is you don't really hear much of this marketed too much, other than it's really marketed towards developers. Essentially, platform as a service are services that developers use to deploy and run their applications. It allows them to spend less time and energy on managing the underlying compute and network infrastructure, and allows them to focus more time on running the application. So in keeping with our theme of dwelling, you can kind of think of platform as a service as like a tiny house. You have kind of all the core services there, but you have kind of very limited aspects of what you can do with those. Some key attributes of platform as a service are there's a moderate level of customization. Frequently you have just a few things that you can tweak. And then it also requires a moderate level of administration. You've got to manage some aspects of the deployment. So what is LabKey cloud hosting? Well, it's a combination of infrastructure as a service and software as a service. It's a fully managed service that manages the aspects of running LabKey and combines that with the power of LabKey software and running it in the cloud. So in keeping with our dwelling theme as an analogy, as I've been talking about, you can think of LabKey cloud hosting as something like a super fancy condo where you have your own entrance, a bellhop, and a concierge. It's single tenant, so all your services are isolated for you and your organization's use only. It offers a moderate level of customization. You have full administration access to the LabKey application, but without the headaches of keeping that system up to date and tuned. It offers low overhead, We take on the challenging aspects of keeping the system up to date, and that ultimately lowers your costs in both area of time and effort. So my colleague, Isa, is now going to talk about some of the 3 key approaches that we use in developing and deploying the LabKey Cloud.
Hey there. So as Stuart mentioned, there's 3 key approaches that we use when developing the LabKey Cloud. They consist of design, automation, and defense. So we'll be going through these and talk about them. So first up, design. We start with a tiered application design that separates out the web application layer from the database layer. We use network segmentation to isolate client LabKey applications from each other. Next, we use network access control lists, or NACLs, and firewalls to limit the network traffic to only that which is used by the LabKey applications. And of course, we've implemented encryption everywhere. So at the OS level, at the database level, the file system level, and the transport layer. So some examples of what that means, because it's a little bit of a word salad, is so file system backups, for example, are stored in an encrypted fashion, or database snapshots are also encrypted while they're stored. And of course, we have HTTPS, so traffic as it enters and leaves the application, and the virtualized network that we mentioned earlier is encrypted. So automation. Automation is a big part of LabKey cloud hosting. So to implement a lot of the features and functionality that we're going to be talking about, we have employed automation. It's achieved through automation. So it could really be its own presentation. So I'll try to keep it semi-brief, but I'm going to go into a little bit more depth before we get to defense. So thank you. So as we built the LabKey cloud hosting platform, it became clear to us that while it is possible to build and deploy a cloud environment manually, it becomes increasingly burdensome to maintain that environment over time. So this graph is trying to demonstrate that while the initial effort is high to automate the deployment of the environment, the risk and cost of maintaining the environment thereafter actually decreases over time compared to a manual deployment that requires continual updates. So if you contrast an automated deployment with a manual deployment, have a lower initial cost of effort, but the maintenance of the environment increases over time. So the risks, you can actually categorize the maintenance of a manually deployed environment increasing as higher risk of configuration drift, and also higher security risks as you are having to manually apply security updates. We can do the next slide. So why automate? It's probably obvious for lots of reasons. My favorite one is you get your infrastructure as code. So in my mind, this is the #1 reason to automate pretty much anything. You already know what good code management looks like, and you know now you can do that with your infrastructure. So it allows you to make changes and plan changes, test changes, review changes, all the good stuff that you do with your regular code bases now applies to your infrastructure. And I feel I should tell you all that you narrowly avoided me using some truly garish word art just because I couldn't figure out how to get it into Google Slides, but just be thankful that all you had to deal with was the little reflection there. Can we get the next slide? So we use a number of tools to automate LabKey deployment and LabKey cloud hosting. For provisioning, there's Terraform and Packer. For configuration, there's Chef. For auditing, there's Inspect, AWS Inspector, and Wuzza. And then for monitoring, there's Splunk, Wuzza, CloudWatch, and OpsGenie. So I think we have a couple more than that, but these are like the core tools. So we've had a lot of success with something called the blue-green deployment model. So this is where you have your first copy of the infrastructure, your blue copy. And then when you want to upgrade that infrastructure, you stand up a second copy, your green copy. And once everything's all set up and put together, then you can transfer traffic from the old blue copy to the new green copy. And this has a couple of advantages. First, and almost foremost, it allows you to do fallback. So if for whatever reason, your new instance of the application and infrastructure isn't working or isn't set up correctly, you still have the old one available to you to revert back to. So it also causes less service disruption because the only service disruption you actually have is when you're transitioning traffic from like the old instance to the new instance, rather than having to turn everything off, stand up a new copy, and then route traffic to that copy. So, and another, I've already talked about it a little bit, but another advantage of having a blue-green deployment model is no more in-place patches. So you're not going in and taking some ancient like virtual machine, for example, and applying a bunch of patches, installing OS updates. Instead, you're standing up a new copy of this virtual machine and applying all your changes to that. So it keeps you from falling into that rut of having a really old copy of everything and having to manually update it. Can we get the next slide, please? So the next approach that I'm going to talk about is defense. It's easily our most important approach. As mentioned earlier, we considered security as a part of the design. We use firewalls and network access control lists to restrict network traffic to only what the application uses. In addition, we also have implemented a web application firewall. So this allows us to block known bad actors or IP addresses, or categorize network traffic that might be intrusive or unwanted, and deny that at the application layer, which is nice. So in our compliant cloud offering, we implemented even more defense type strategies. So that list includes intrusion detection, prevention, log monitoring, and vulnerability scans. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So just some high level best practice takeaways that we've come across. So the first item on the list here, plan for change. A rigid design does not take into account future changes that can make future work more difficult. So a simple example is with those network access control lists. On a lot of cloud platforms, including AWS, the one that we use, the number of rules in that list is fixed. So what we've done is actually leave gaps in the rule numbers, so that allows us to come in later and add rules that we might have had to change. If we had just crammed that list full of rules to begin with, we wouldn't have anywhere to go to make those changes. So definitely consider using a cloud provider. Cloud providers give you access to more tools than you would likely have on premise. And in addition, they have a shared responsibility model. So that allows you to shed some of the compliance obligations and the maintenance obligations that normally you would have to deal with yourself if you were on premise or if you were using your own organization's IT infrastructure. So definitely prioritize security and defense. If you don't make it a priority, I can guarantee that somebody else will, and you don't want to be caught flat-footed and scrambling. So as I already shared, investing in automation has significant rewards. Hopefully that's obvious through this presentation. All to enforce, audit, and validate design decisions. And of course, use encryption anywhere. So a last couple ones, deploying manually with no automation is definitely a recipe for failure. Have some automation. And then lastly, compliance is more than just implementing security infrastructure design. This happens a lot. You hear people who want to be compliant, but don't plan and don't do all of the extra steps apart from just managing infrastructure to get to compliance. So there's a substantial amount of work and effort involved in implementing the supporting policies, procedures, and documentations that are required to meet compliance obligations. So plan for that. So I'm going to hand this back to Stuart now. He's going to talk a little bit about our service offerings.
Yeah, so as we start to wrap up, let's briefly talk about our LabKey service offerings. We offer 3 tiers of cloud hosting: starter, compliant, and starter, professional, and compliant. Our starter tier is typically for smaller labs and organizations that are just starting to use LabKey. It has a moderate level of performance and a single instance of LabKey. It's fully managed, and you gain all the benefits that we've been talking about in our best practices. It's secure by design, and we take on the responsibility of updating the operating system and all the other dependencies that are needed to run the LabKey application. And of course, we manage the software updates associated with LabKey as well. Our professional tier is our most popular. It offers 2 instances of LabKey, a staging and a production instance. The staging instance allows you to test new versions of LabKey or other changes that you might need to make in a test environment so that you can test them before promoting them into your production environment. The professional tier offers improved system performance and storage over the starter tier. And of course, you get all of the benefits that we talked about in the starter. And we also extend the backup retention history. Our compliance tier is for those organizations that have compliance obligations. In addition to added storage and backup for those that are needed for those types of compliance operations, we beef up the system performance over the other tiers and add additional storage, as well as the security and services and protections that we talked about. And those include additional things such as intrusion detection and prevention, log monitoring, vulnerability scans, and the security ceremonies and things that need to be done associated with that. You heard perhaps earlier today, Adam talk about the FDA My Studies. That application runs in our compliance tier. So why choose us? Well, we recognize that installing, running, and keeping LabKey up to date is challenging. Our services combine the skill and knowledge of running applications in the cloud, along with the expertise and best practices of running LabKey. You gain the benefit of all the best practices we talked about today, and we offer a fully managed service. So it takes the pain and suffering out of running LabKey and takes that burden off of you and your organization, and allows us to take that burden on and help you achieve your goals. So this allows you to focus on changing the world, and we'll handle the hosting. All right, so we can take your questions.
We've already got some in the chat. So I'm seeing one. Do you automate blue-green deployments? Do you also do blue-green deployments just for whole server upgrades? Or do you also do it for module deployments and modify database schemas? So
you want to do this, or shall I?
I can do it. So for LabKey cloud hosting, we generally do full blue-green deployments for LabKey version upgrades, or if we need to make like deep changes to the infrastructure for a given customer, then we'll deploy a brand new environment with that customer's data applied to it. So generally speaking, we wouldn't do a blue-green deployment just to update a module, but we'd do a blue-green deployment if we were upgrading the version of LabKey. So we've got another question here. Let's see. Is LabKey investigating container platforms, things like Helm charts and Doe deployments? We'd love to. There's an internal initiative to get our hosting infrastructure into a more containerized environment, but at the moment, it's more old school with virtual machines that we manage through configuration management and that kind of a thing. So in the future, I'd like to. I cannot make any promises that user conference, but we'd love to offer that publicly.
All right, I see another question. Is multi-region deployment of LabKey possible? That's not part of our standard offering in the sense of being, generally we serve our LabKey cloud hosting in a single region, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. We can certainly work with you if that's what your level of interest is. But we can certainly do that. We operate today in multiple regions. Our services are spread out through a few of the Amazon regions today.
So should I answer this next one?
Well, let me read it for you then. This one's yours, definitely. Do you guys have a containerized or Vagrant or Packer GitHub repos for developer environments?
Not yet, but a lot of we're a very developer-oriented company. So like if you refer back to Susan's presentation earlier, there's a lot of tooling for done through Gradle and like our new reliance on Artifactory for precompiled binaries of stuff that are geared towards making development a bit easier. At the moment, we do not have like a containerized development environment or an official Vagrant or Packer manifest or Vagrant file that we offer. But that isn't to say that we don't care about those things. Developer ease is very important as a company. So
I would add that we do have some examples of a container in our LabKey samples repo that we have. It's been we update that periodically. So if you need a container for an example for a developer type of deployment, there is one that you can take a look at there. Okay, next question. This I think be joint one for you and I. Is it possible to add an additional environment or two within a cloud deployment? For example, suppose a group was using Cloud Professional but wanted a QA environment in addition to the product or production and staging environments that come with the professional package. Could this be set up? So the answer to that is yes. We have these general tiers that we offer services for, but that is a baseline for you to be able to offer services for. So we do have custom use cases, and we've done those in the past. So for example, if you wanted another environment, that's certainly possible. And rather easy for us, we would just add one more deployment to our model and use the automation to do that. Isa, you got anything to add to that?
No, that about sums it up.